Stakeholders and valued partners of Pacific Tourism to continue refining the work that we do in terms of the way we see tourism developed at the national level in each of our communities, and influence how support and policies across our countries are developed and shaped to support that future we want tourism to contribute to in the Pacific. And so with those very few remarks, I'd like to welcome you and thank you again. And we now invite Penny to take us through the presentation for this morning. And we also would like to give you the opportunity to also ask questions or give us feedback, further feedback that will help Penny and the team as well as SPTO in finalizing the document for endorsement by our board of directors in May. So with that, I extend the opportunity now to you, Penny. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Christina, and it's lovely to see you all back here again, and thank you very much for taking time out of your day. This morning, we're just going to run through briefly the feedback that we have received on the framework to date. And we were hoping that we would be far more advanced to actually be able to talk you through the final framework, but we've only just finished receiving the comments as of late last week. So we're still working through them. But firstly, I would like to acknowledge the comments that we have received and the effort that you have put into providing us with the feedback which we are using to strengthen the framework. And I'd like to acknowledge that because it's taken obviously time out of your busy schedules to actually take the time and provide that. And some of the comments were quite detailed and some were very broad, but either way, what it did is provided very useful direction for us. So thank you. We've just had a few little technical issues this morning, so I'm sharing my screen from Fiji while I sit here in Australia. So I might need to ask, I think it's Ahmed, I'm not sure who's controlling the screen there, to move through. I have asked for control of the slide, but it doesn't appear to be moving for me. So I might just ask someone who's sitting in the Fiji office to move to the next slide if we can. Thank you. Okay, so you'll recall over the last, well, it's been a bit of a gap in our discussion so far, but we had many meetings to discuss the framework and to take you through and to have robust discussions about what we needed to include in the framework. And what we found is that we had a very rich level of interest right across all the different partners for the development of the framework. And that support has continued because we have seen the same interest coming through in the comments that we have received. So one thing I just wanted to reinstate here is that the framework is built on a partnership, and that partnership commenced when we started this work with you. And what we'd like to see continue and what is embedded in the framework is that partnership that will continue going forward. And that's important because it's not just the SPTO's responsibility, nor is it the national government's responsibility, but indeed it is industry, it is the development partners, and it is also the global agencies who can support the transition to more sustainable tourism. The other important component or the contributor to sustainable tourism is community. And that's something that certainly came out through discussions and certainly has come through the feedback as well on the draft framework. The other aspect to include and what we're all here to discuss is obviously the visitor themselves. So looking at the market side, what is it that we can do to encourage the right type of visitor, but also when they arrive in our destinations is what can we do to encourage the right type of behaviour that will support and sustain the communities and the environmental and cultural values on which tourism depends. So we worked with you to develop the shared vision, and there have been a few comments coming through on that shared vision. I might just move to the next slide. Thank you. Just to recall, the aim of the framework is to make sure that we have actionable policies to support you, and that's industry, government, and all the different partners to advance sustainable tourism in the Pacific through impactful decisions and the right kind of investment. It's very clearly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we can't lose sight of that. And that's one of the comments that has come through in the framework, is that we need to make sure that we're weaving and aligning the framework to the Sustainable Development Goals. And that becomes very important with respect to the monitoring and evaluation framework to measure the performance towards sustainable tourism. Thank you. Next slide. So the feedback we've received, I'm just going to run through this very quickly. And as I said, we're still actually firming up the final framework. But the good news is there hasn't been a significant change in the direction. What we have been doing is fine-tuning and going back over what we've said and what you've said in your feedback to create a stronger and a better framework for you to move forward. Thank you. Next slide. So we received around 15 sets of different comments that came through on the template. We also just received emails and also had conversations with a number of people as well. We've divided up the comments into, various aspects, I suppose, and it's a little bit hard to do this because comments were, some of them were quite broad and touched on various things, whereas various parts of the content, whereas other comments were directly related to specific matters in the framework. But generally, people were commenting on the vision and goals. They commented on specific policies and actions that they felt needed to be either made clearer or addressed because they weren't strong enough in the framework. There were some comments around the layout and format, and then the general acceptability or alignment with the nation's current approach, which was good to understand that there was nothing contradictory or conflicting for those nations who are already on the path of sustainable tourism. Because you may recall from the outset, we want this framework to be supportive and to be complementary to the work that's already being done across the Pacific, but also a good guidance framework for those who are just getting started. Thank you. Next slide. So just running through here the comments and feedback, and because there was so much rich feedback, I've really tried to pick out the main points. So what we heard was that, particularly from our global partners and our regional partners, is that we need to provide greater recognition and integration of the UNWTO's guiding principles for responsible recovery of tourism. We need to make sure that the UNWTO's measuring the sustainability of tourism is included in the framework as a reference for the monitoring and evaluation of the sustainable tourism framework. We need to make sure that we have direct links to the Pacific Tourism Statistics Strategy. And also, and there was, much discussion around the importance of placing the Pacific Digital Strategy at the centre of this sustainable tourism framework. And I think that is one of the most important, not important, but one of the most useful parts of the feedback, because we certainly, I guess we assumed the digital capability and the digital strategy guiding the development and the capacity of digital marketing and so forth across the Pacific. We didn't really embed the need for the strategy, the digital strategy, to be embedded in the framework. But when we took another look at it, it's absolutely essential. So thank you for that feedback. And we've now made sure that we have referenced the importance of digital technology in all aspects of sustainable tourism. It doesn't just rely or is dependent on certainly marketing. It goes much further and beyond that. There were some comments also about the vision. Should the vision be 2030 or should it be beyond? Should it be over to 2050 or should it be within 2030 and 2050? We've also heard from people suggesting that we add a few other bits and pieces to the vision, which I'll take you through in a minute. The goals, there was particular emphasis around goal 4. Most of the other goals were considered acceptable, but we have been asked to emphasise climate change and disaster resilience. And there was also some good points made about recognising airline emissions as an issue and encouraging carbon offsets through programs that benefit the Pacific. So I think that that is something that we can address in the framework, recognising that obviously the airline industry, the aviation industry is a key partner, but certainly encouraging carbon positive initiatives within the Pacific can certainly help both encourage good behaviour from visitors, but also offset some of the costs and build resilience across the Pacific. So there's a nice link there. The other area that we were asked to expand upon was the plastics in terms of the waste. So we've certainly addressed waste, but we need to give more emphasis to the plastics initiatives that are going on in the Pacific and the need to do more. In terms of the priorities, certainly the feedback was that we are on track with those priorities. There is no significant change, with the exception of the priorities under the goal 4 that need to expand to include that climate change and disaster resilience. And then the policies and actions, there was general agreement with some edits. Now those policies and actions are too detailed to go through with you today. But most of the edits and suggestions I can pick out once we get to that slide and let you know. Thank you. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. There were a number of comments that came through, particularly from industry, which I thought was very, very helpful. Is the need to emphasise and focus on the small, medium enterprises that make up the tourism industry across the Pacific, and the challenges that are in front of them are as a result of COVID, but the challenges that are in front of them even without COVID. So that is in COVID recovery. So that is an important aspect, and we've been trying to pick through the policies to make sure that we certainly do emphasise that, but also importantly, providing the opportunity and support for the SMEs to recover, but also to move into and transition towards more sustainable tourism. There was also some comments also from industry about the need for broader public education within communities about the value of tourism and the importance of it, because there were some views that perhaps as a result of COVID, there has been some resentment around tourism operations having to close down, which has had impact on income and employment across communities, when indeed, you know, like we know globally, it has been impactful on all industry and particularly tourism industry all over the world. So the need for the importance of more community education about the value of tourism, but also, you know, the complexities of it. The other aspect of some of the feedback coming through was the importance of aligning the financial support and incentives, particularly to SMEs, to encourage sustainable tourism outcomes. And that financial support was also linked to donor support, suggesting that, you know, donor support needed to be aligned to more sustainable tourism programs and projects to support the delivery of the framework. In general, there was a number of comments that came through that we need to make sure that it is clear that there is now an urgent imperative for action on sustainable tourism. it should not be seen as a nice thing to do or optional for industry or government. The message was very clear from the feedback that came in that there is an urgency now for action, and the framework should be positioned as such. The other feedback about roles and responsibilities, particularly around the role of the SPTO, separating that out from regional partners and making the SPTO's role clear, as well as other roles, which we have stated you'll recall in the framework, the actions for each of the partners to take up, but separating the SPTO role out is important. There was also some feedback around the need to ensure now, not encourage, but ensure that industry undertake responsible business practices. And that should be in the form of the minimum standards that have been identified in the framework already, but through regulation and policy, and also through incentives for business to ensure that they're taking up responsible business practices. And in supporting that, it's one thing to say it, but it's important to build the capacity of the local businesses to understand what is required from them, from both the market perspective, from visitors' perspective, and how to embed sustainable practice for your visitors, but also what good business practice actually means. And that will certainly help them to become more sustainable, but also more resilient. So building the capacity in that area. The next one, sustainable financing, I've just touched on before, was around seeking buy-in from development partners and making it clear in the framework how they can support its delivery. And that because there are so many development partners and different agencies involved at a global level, that they should be subscribing to the initiatives and programs in the framework, and that they should be aligning their funding programs with that. And then finally, the need for an action plan, which clearly states what we need to do first and what we need to do in the next few years, and then what we need to do in the later years. And of course, that can only really be a guide for those nations that have developed and are moving forward in a different pathway, or indeed in a more advanced pathway on sustainable tourism. So we need to acknowledge that for those who are more advanced and for those who are not so advanced. Thank you. Could I have the next slide, please? You will recall there were some guiding principles there are guiding principles in the framework, and the guiding principles are really there to acknowledge the commitment that each of the partners need to undertake to ensure delivery of the framework. So to some extent, it does become binding in terms of the guiding principles that we are asking, or the framework asks all partners to commit to the principles. The comments that came through were really helpful here. Particularly, there was a comment indeed during the workshops around, perhaps balancing growth with sustainability is not the right language. So we've taken a look at that, and we absolutely agree that it is not one priority over the other. It is actually both priorities at the same time. And that language has now changed, and I think the principle is called something else. Can't actually recall what it is, but it's around recovery and growth, and then a statement in there about what that actually means. So moving forward with both priorities in sight. The next principle we were asked to add was around the importance of community engagement and empowerment, and that is stating a commitment to have greater engagement and community support for tourism, or at least empowerment to determine the way tourism, or if tourism and the way tourism is to be developed. So that is now embedded as a principle. The principle of building resilience and what that actually means. So we've now included that, and made a statement about what that actually means. So it covers all aspects of sustainable tourism. So we've included a statement around that. Excuse me. The other principle that was, I guess, not so necessarily asked to be a principle, but we felt that it's important that we don't lose sight of the importance of digital transformation. And this speaks to the comment I mentioned previously about the digital strategy. And the principle of digital transformation is exceedingly important as the Pacific economies recover. And we can see the impact of digitalisation all across the world, and the impact that it can have, and in terms of the opportunities it can have for the tourism sector, and obviously much broader than that. But looking at the opportunities for digital transformation, not just, as I said before, in terms of marketing, but in all aspects of the tourism value chain, and particularly in terms of the sustainability of tourism. So we've included that as a principle, that it needs to be acknowledged because it does impact on the framework itself, but also clearly the monitoring and evaluation of the framework going forward. And that brings us to the last principle that we were asked to add, which is around measuring sustainable tourism and the importance of moving towards a broader set of parameters for measurement, not just economic, which we are all very familiar with in terms of economic growth and the relationship that tourism has on that. So we've been asked to include that as a principle, that we acknowledge that sustainable tourism cannot just be measured in terms of GDP and visitor arrivals. That's a very useful tool, but we need to dig deeper and explore ways to measure the value of tourism on our communities, and particularly for those groups such as women and youth or younger people who we are trying to target to generate benefits for. Could we move to the next slide, please? Now, I do apologise for the quality of this slide because we're still, busy trying to work out the nuances of the words that are going into the final framework. But here is, I guess, what it's currently looking like at the moment. We're still tweaking with it, and I'm very keen to get your feedback today. So in terms of our vision, I'll go through this in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. We've separated these out because they are a little hard to see. We have made some changes to the vision and a few changes to the goals and a few changes to the priorities. And when you look at that slide just as it is, we have not changed the number of goals. They have kept it 4. You'll see some tweaks in the vision I'll go through in the minute. Goal 1 and goal 2 primarily remain the same. Goal 3, we have been asked to add reference to creative industries. We're not entirely sure whether it should be stated there in goal 3, but you'll see it further down in the language that supports that goal. And then, of course, goal 4, healthy islands and oceans. Now, we've been asked to reference climate change here, which we have done, and I'd like to get some feedback today specifically if we have done that in the right way. We haven't put goal 4 in the, we haven't put climate change in the statement around healthy islands and oceans. We've just kept that as the outcome, and climate change is obviously an impact and a risk and a threat to healthy islands and oceans. So we have just kept it down in the actual description. I might just go to the next slide because it becomes a bit clearer as we go through. Thank you. Okay, so let's just focus on our vision. So we've kept it at 2030. Now, we had quite a lengthy discussion about this, whether we should push it out to 2050 or somewhere in between 2030 and 2050. we felt, and the collective view was, that 2030 is a good benchmark because it is aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. If we push it out too far, we will lose sight of what we need to do. And it also goes back to that comment about the urgent imperative to act now to ensure that we recover in a sustainable way. So putting it at 2030 gives us a 10-year, roughly, a 10-year run-up to achieve this vision. Now, we would certainly expect that this vision will need to be revised by the time we get to 2030. However, we feel that at this stage, it's best to keep it at that timeframe. Now, the changes here include the words around resilient and inclusive, and we've also changed the last words there to islands and ocean ecosystems. So that's the way it currently stands. It is a little bit long, and we would like to bring it down to make it shorter. So we'd love your feedback if you can in the chat, if anyone wants to make a comment, or just flick us an email, just very simply on those words. It's very important, and we value that. We value your feedback on that. I might just pause if, Christina, if we'd just like to ask if anyone has any comments. I invite you, or invite people through you to make a comment now if they'd like to over the microphone.
Thank you, Penny. I'd now like to invite the participants online. If there's any comments specifically on what has been covered so far, we welcome your feedback. You can use the raise hand icon, or you can unmute yourself and speak. Yeah. Let's see.
Hello, this is Katerina Singalatris from the Global Green Grid Institute. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was really great to see, and although I haven't been able to participate before, I've been following this conversation very closely as GGI is about to embark on some work on sustainable tourism with Fiji government as well. My question is, my understanding from watching this is that renewable energy and energy efficiency would likely fall under Goal 1, under sustainable investments for the industry, and also under Goal 4 on climate change and low emissions. Is my understanding correct on that? And would you have any other comments on where sustainable energy would fall?
Thank you, Katerina. Penny, would you like to respond? I think this question was around renewable energy and whether it applies to Goal 1 and Goal 4. I guess it's both. From my understanding of the current write-up of the document, definitely under Goal 4, but also in terms of investment, we have covered that under Goal 1. And I'll leave it to Penny if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that, Penny.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Katerina. Good questions. Yes, it does appear in both, but mostly the emphasis is in Goal 4.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Elise has made a good comment. Thank you in the chat to say that tents should be active if possible in the vision. I agree, so we can include that. Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any more comments coming through?
Scroll down so we can see.
I will go through the next slide, which sets out the goals and the priorities as well. So we can move on if people wanted to take another look at those as well.
Yep, that'll be good, Penny.
Okay, once again, apologies for the quality. It's not so good here, but I will explain this to you. So Goal 1, prosperous economies, has not really changed particularly. It is about supporting the prosperous and resilient economies and the communities. and it does make reference to supporting sustainable tourism investments, including green investments and sustainable and other investments and finance support particularly for small medium enterprises mentioned before. Goal 2, it's pretty much stays the way it was. Goal 3, we have added creative industries, as there was an expression that perhaps we needed to include and be more inclusive of the creative industries, because that is a significant part of cultures, and it does need to be stated. So we have added that, and I do value any feedback on that goal. And then goal 4, we have restated goal 4, the text that sits underneath it, that tourism accelerates climate action, protects ecosystems at risk, and enhances their resilience. Now, sitting under goal 4, we'll see some of those priorities coming out to support that shortly. Just wanted to receive any comments on these goals as they sit. Christina, if there is anyone who would like to make a comment, we'd appreciate that. I've seen a comment come through on the chat, no mention of persons with disabilities, and wonder whether inclusion should be included somewhere in the principle. It is included in goal 2. But it's not stated as a particular inclusion in goal 2. It certainly appears in the principles as well. So we just wanted to make that point that inclusivity is included in the principles, but does not sit here as a word in the goals. Happy to have some feedback, please.
Yep. Any stakeholders today who'd like to raise any questions around the goals?
Elise has made a good comment there. Thriving and inclusive communities could be considered. Thank you, Elise.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Elise. Anyone else? Maybe we can move on to the priorities, Benny. And maybe some comments will come from there.
Next slide, please. Okay, so what we've tried to do here is, for ease of kind of trying to keep it to 2 priorities for under each goal. Not sure if it really works. We're still playing with it a bit. So enabling environments to support sustainable tourism investment sits under goal 1. So Katerina, going back to your point, that's the reference there. We have combined the unique and distinctive destination positioning, planning, and quality products, experiences and services. I think that's a bit wordy, but we're trying to bring that down a bit to combine, and this is really around combining the importance of destination positioning and supported by quality products, experiences and services. So we're really kind of combining those 2 priorities and putting the policies so that they go together, they sit together, and they're not seen as separate, because one of the key aspects from this framework is the importance of positioning destinations to ensure that the messaging is right around sustainable tourism, but also secondly, providing those supporting experiences for visitors that speak to that positioning. And that comes from ensure that the destinations are globally competitive, but also that they are honouring the very values on which tourism depends. The second one is around strengthening social inclusion. So that is that goal 2 that was mentioned before. Do we have inclusion somewhere? Strengthening social inclusion, which was there and still sits there, and repurposing tourism as a supporter of Pacific communities. The words, there has been some comments that's come through from SPTO actually around using a different word rather than repurposing. This slide, unfortunately, we haven't made that change yet, so we will do that. and that is, enabling tourism or supporting tourism as a supporter of Pacific communities rather than repurposing, because the change does not need to be repurposed, but rather refined, I guess. The third goal, which is around the cultural and creative industries, is around cultural preservation, protection and promotion. The other priority we have added, which is based on your feedback, is around including a priority around enabling prosperous cultural and creative industries. And that really speaks to the regional cultural strategy that is currently being prepared as well. So we've tried to align the development of that framework and the key themes coming out of that with the Sustainable Tourism Framework. The last but most important one here, and we are still kind of moving this around a little bit, is the importance of healthy islands, healthy oceans, and climate action. We've kept this to 2 priorities, and we're kind of moving it into 3 and then pulling it back to 2. But it's really around the protection of island, coastal and ocean ecosystems, and we haven't really received any feedback to suggest that that is not right. What we did have in the draft was the importance to transition to a low emission resource efficient sector, but we've also received feedback about the importance of climate resilience, climate and risk resiliency. So we're playing with this priority at the moment and the actions that sit underneath that. So there are a few additional actions that need to be embedded within this priority if it stays the way it is in terms of climate resilience. And that very much speaks to the green investments and blue carbon opportunities that the Pacific presents. So that's broadly the priorities. We are still tweaking them, so I really do value any feedback at this stage, Christina, about what people are thinking. I don't think I have any further slides. If you could just flick down for me, I think I might be out of slides now. Yeah, we have. So if you could just leave it on the priority slide. Thank you. And really value the opportunity now, Christina and the SPTO team, to just open this up for a good chat and conversation. And also anybody who'd like to add things on the chat function. I'm reviewing these as we go, which is fantastic, and trying to capture people's thoughts. And it's all really helpful for us. And indeed, I wish I could do this every day so we could capture all your thoughts as we move through and change the document. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny, for the presentation. I'd now like to open up the floor to our participants online to see if there's any feedback, comments, or questions. So Penny, I think in the chat, there's a comment from Matthew on the wording of the vision. The Pacific Islands will be empowered and benefiting from, or should it read empowered by and benefiting from? I guess it's, the point is that the wording will have a different meaning or impact on the overall vision.
Yeah, great comment and good pickup. Thank you. We'll give some thought to that. It's probably the latter. It is minor, but it does affect the meaning. Does anyone have a particular view about that?
Okay, maybe we'll reflect on that and probably have come back on the revised change when the framework is in almost final draft. Maybe we move on to the next comments from Liz.
Yeah. The comment there is that prosperous, goal 1 mentions prosperous economies, but it's not in our priorities. There is no mention of economies. So how will economies be reflected in the priorities?
Right.
That is a good point, and it does come through, particularly in respect to priority number 1. There are a number of policies and actions to support prosperous economies, particularly around what national governments can do in terms of their policy, their legislative and their policy and planning frameworks to support sustainable tourism. And then it does go into further detail about other actions that can be taken. So whilst it's not mentioned in goal 1, priorities, we can certainly acknowledge and see what we can do to add that. Katerina, thank you. You've acknowledged that with respect to that meaning in the vision, she's added it should be the latter that has been suggested by Matthew, that it should be by, empowered by, and benefiting from. Thank you.
Yeah.
There was also just an earlier comment from Warwick about how we are defining creative industries. I've just made a point of that. I think we have defined it, and we're using the previous reference to creative industries from the regional strategy, cultural strategy for creative industries, and from other sources. But I'll just double check that we have included.
So maybe another way, Penny, will be in the glossary of key terms.
Yes,
Yeah,
we
we
could
can
do
put
that.
creative industries there.
Yeah.
Oh, Alice is also mentioning that there is a standard UNESCO definition, yeah, which I'm pretty sure it should be the same as the one that you SPC uses. So
Yeah.
we'll check both and make sure that we have it included in the glossary.
Yep, that I can confirm. Thank you.
Yeah.
The question regarding COVID-19 has crippled tourism in the Pacific. So how does the framework address, reduce and aid the recovery from the impact of COVID? Well, it's a very good question, and there are COVID recovery strategies in place. And SPTO have obviously been doing some good work there, as well as each of the other nations. The framework positions itself to acknowledge those strategies, but then also launch in, I guess, to the next stage, post-immediate recovery, which is around recovering sustainably. So very much in the front of the document, we talk about the importance of taking action now, recovering sustainably, and what that actually means and what the principles are. So that the UNWTO have provided some very useful guidance on what sustainable recovery looks like. And we've followed that. We've tried to follow that, that thinking throughout the document. Anne has said, should gender be mentioned in the priorities? Is that covered under strengthening social inclusion? Should it be strengthening social and gender inclusion? Thanks very much, Anne. And I think our view there is that we have acknowledged the importance of gender inclusion, but also the importance of generating opportunity for young people. And we also need to acknowledge the other disadvantaged groups within community. So my preference would be here, or my suggestion would be, rather than singling out gender, social inclusion should be all encompassing, and particularly for those disadvantaged groups. But I will be guided by the rest of the group if they feel that you would like gender represented in those priorities, or whether disadvantaged groups, or whether it should be more specific.
Is there any feedback around gender? Maybe not now, Benny.
Okay, just let's move through. Jessie, thanks, Jess. You've suggested to add the second priority in Pillar 1 that drive value for local economies. That's great, thank you. What happened to, there's a comment here, what happened to protection and promotion of biodiversity that was listed as a priority? It's still there. Protection of island, coastal and ocean ecosystems. And we have just expanded that further in the action. So we can take another look at that to see if that has changed its meaning. But that's certainly the original intent, is the promotion and protection of biodiversity.
Yes.
Yeah. Brian has said, agree some concept of financial profitability should be acknowledged and the impact of overall economic growth, well-being and strength. Thank you, Brian, for that comment. Another comment, one of the key issues that has come to light post-pandemic is the identification of domestic tourism. Would there be a need to identify this in the plan? Thank you. That has been identified, and that's certainly a great opportunity. And what's important here, and we have acknowledged that in the framework, is that it's important now to look at the needs of the domestic market, because much of the focus has obviously been on international source markets. But looking at domestic market needs and expectations and the types of products and services that domestic market may be more aligned to. And that's really important strategy for resilience as well. So positioning yourself for international as well as domestic tourism. So that's come to the end now for, as far as I can see in the chat. Warwick has made a comment to say he agrees with social inclusion being retained as broad, with detailed explanation underneath that for in the policies and actions.
Coming back online now to our participants, if there's any other feedback. Or also any points that are important to you that you'd like us to check again, whether they're included when we do the final drafting. Can you minimize the thing so we can see? Okay, Penny, maybe the next steps. There's a tricky question from some of our participants this morning. If we are still giving them opportunity to comment, how late are we going to give to them? We are really hoping that the framework will be finalized by the end of this week. But Penny, would you be able to extend one more day for comments to come in?
Of course, we will do everything we can to include your comments, and we value the feedback because it really does strengthen the document. And Tina, we can talk about what that means. But if you can get those comments to us today or tomorrow, that would be fantastic, because we are on a tight deadline to finish this off.
Thank you, Penny. So in terms of the process, just for the information of everyone, once the framework is finalized, it will go through a vetting process, and that will be done through several mechanisms that we have in place at SPTO. So we have the meeting with the regional working group will be held later today to also get their feedback on what we have been discussing this morning. But we also have a board subcommittee that looks at sustainable tourism and research and statistics activities of SPTO. That board subcommittee will be meeting tomorrow, and they will also have a look through what we've also discussed today. The intention also is that after that process, there will be another meeting of the SPTO board in May. And prior to the main board meeting at the end of May, we will again have a look at the final framework. Now, we will discuss internally and come back to you. If we are really wanting to do, well, we're exploring the opportunity for us to come back to our wider stakeholders with the final draft before we go to the board at the end of May. So that is still to be confirmed. We will look at our timelines, and we will definitely be keeping all our stakeholders informed as we progress. But that's how, that's the plan for the next few weeks and months. But definitely after the endorsement of our board in May, there will be a Council of Tourism Ministers meeting held in October. And the intention is also for the ministers to have a look at the framework and give their endorsement before we proceed into the implementation phase. So that's just a very brief overview on how we will be progressing with taking the work that we've done on the framework to the endorsement process. In the meantime, I think your best option or opportunity is to come back to us via email immediately or even before close of business tomorrow with any final feedback. Penny, would you like to say any final words before we close off our meeting today?
Thanks, Christina. There's just a couple of comments that have come through about one in particular about training and knowledge and where does that fit. That I'll just answer that quickly. That does fit in the monitoring and evaluation framework, and acknowledge that the training and knowledge exchange or capacity building particularly through knowledge exchange, is really important and part of the learning framework. And that director's experience is critical, and sharing that knowledge across the Pacific to move towards more sustainable tourism. It's the only way it can happen. And there's another comment there just directly to me about digital transformation and the importance of just checking whether it should be a principle or whether in the priorities. And another comment's coming through again. Thank you. Capacity constraints are a major issue for SMEs. Absolutely, totally get that. So thank you for that. That is all from me, Tina. Thank you. And thank you very much for the feedback today. It's always really helpful. This framework is for you. It's got to work for you. And that's why this feedback is great to have these discussions. So thank you very much. And as Tina said, send those comments through today, tomorrow. We'll make sure that they get included. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Penny. And just in addition to that last comment about training and knowledge, under priority 1, we have a specific section on human capital and skills development. That also covers a lot of the sharing of experiences and information across the region in terms of sustainability. But yeah, still have a look through what you want to be reflected in the framework, and email us your comments before close of business tomorrow. But thank you again, SPTO members, partners, and stakeholders today. It was lovely having you here. Thank you for the feedback, and keep them coming. The email is sustainable@spto.org. Thank you very much, and you have a good day.